Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait just a minute or two here to make sure everybody who's joining is online and to make sure that we have all of our interpreters on the line as well. So just bear with us for another minute or two here. Thank you. Okay. Um, I'm going to just maybe, Janet, can I check with you, Janet? Do we have the second interpreter on the line at this point, or are we still?
She should be trying to log on now.
Okay. We'll wait another little bit here. Perhaps I can also survey the room. Are we going to require, does anybody on the line right now require interpretation? Maybe that's the better question. Otherwise, we can probably go ahead and get started. If there's no need for interpretation, perhaps then we can go ahead and get going. Okay, well, I think we move ahead and get started with the meeting, and then hopefully our second interpreter can join online if we see the need for it or others join in. So perhaps Vicky, I don't know if you want to do an introduction yet for the interpretation, or is that something that we wanted the other one to do some instructions on? Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and then if someone, Janet or otherwise, can kind of flag me if the second interpreter joins, and then we can provide the instructions and get that going as soon as we're able to, then we'll go ahead and get that started. But I'm going to go ahead and start the meeting off because we got a pretty full agenda and we want time for a lot of feedback today. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So once again, welcome again to this warehouse working group meeting, December 4th, I believe. So thank you everyone for joining again. Before we begin, just another couple of announcements. This should look similar to what you've seen before. Everyone except the presenter will be muted unless you're called on by the host. Please save any questions or comments until the end of each section that we will be presenting, and then interpretation will be available. And finally, we'll be recording and posting the recording of this meeting on the district's YouTube page following the meeting. Next slide, please. To ensure the meetings are effective and inclusive, all members agree to recognize and adhere to the following meeting rules and guidelines of participation. Please create space for everyone to contribute. Only one person speaks at a time. Listen to each other, respect each other's opinions, knowledge, and perspectives, and be conscious of time constraints, which we'll go over later in the presentation. And meetings will be moderated by district staff. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of what we're going to be covering today in today's presentation. We're going to be taking attendance very shortly here. We're going to be doing it a little different just to save some time, I think. We're going to be recapping the WWG meetings timeline. We're going to have an overview of the rule development process should a regulatory measure proceed. We're going to be present various definitions of a warehouse for consideration and feedback. We're going to be discussing a couple of possible non-regulatory strategies that we wanted to get some good feedback on today. And then time permitting, we'll address any non-agenda items that we may have. Next slide, please. So again, we just wanted to spend a couple minutes getting attendance here. So what I think we're going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and go down through the participant list. I see some familiar faces and names now. We've done a couple of these meetings already, so I just want to go ahead and kind of go through those, hopefully to save a little time on the introduction side. So I will go ahead and introduce myself first again for anybody who's new here. Nick Cormier, Supervising Area Resources Specialist overseeing the Rule Development Division here in APCD. I'll turn it over to Randy and we'll just kind of do a round robin of district staff first, and then I'll go through the names on the participant list. So Randy, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Thank you, Nick. Hello, everyone. My name is Randy Consolation, Associate Engineer in Rule Development. Next, Kathy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kathy Kean. I'm the Chief of our Emission Reduction Strategies section here at the district, and I'll bounce it over to Janet.
Hi, everyone. Janet McHugh with Rule Development.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Watt, Deputy Director over our emission reductions team here at APCD. Happy to have you all on board. And I think Paula may be with us as well.
Yes, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm Paula Forbes, Air Pollution Control Officer for the district. Thanks. I think that's it for APCD staff, unless I'm missing someone.
I think that's it as well. Thank you, staff, for doing that. So now I'm just going to go kind of alphabetically down the list here. I'm going to say everybody's name. If I don't know your affiliation, if you could just chime in real quick to state your affiliation, that would be great.
Excuse me, Nick.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Our second interpreter is here.
Oh,
Gloria should be taking the lead on that.
Great. Gloria, Vicky, would this be a good time for you to kind of do some quick instructions on interpretation?
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. All right. So what do you want me to do now?
If you could just briefly provide some instructions about how people can access the interpretation features.
Okay, it's usually I just usually read it from the screen. Do you have that or not?
I don't know.
Okay. So do you want me to do it in English and Spanish?
If you could, yeah, briefly, that would be great.
Okay, good afternoon. I am Gloria Leonard. I'm one of the Spanish interpreters. I am going to give you instructions to access the language channel. At the bottom of the screen, you're going to see a globe. You can click on that, and then you're going to see Spanish and English. Choose the English if you feel more comfortable listening to this meeting in English. You can click, and that's all you have to do. If you would like to listen to the interpreter only, you can remove the the general audio, not removed, but just silence general audio, and you should be okay. If you have any problems, you can write it in the chat, or you can say it out loud, and we'll figure it out what the problem is. Hopefully you won't have to. Muy buenas tardes, mi nombre es Gloria Leonard y soy una de las intérpretes de español. Quería darles instrucciones para poder acceder al a la interpretación el día de hoy. Vamos primeramente a indicarles que está el globito en la parte de abajo de la pantalla. Para acceder al idioma en español pueden hacerle clic. En el globito van a ver la opción de español e inglés. Escojan el español y prendan su micrófono si desean hablar, y de lo contrario todo va a estar bien, a menos que tengan algún problema. Lo pueden escribir en el chat o lo pueden decir en voz alta. Muchas gracias. Okay.
Great, thank you so much. And I see the globe has just, I think the globe has just popped up, so feel free to select the language of your choice at this point. So now going back to our attendance, I'm going to go down the participant list just in order that I see it on my end. And I see some folks have already started putting in their affiliation on the name. I do appreciate that. That does help. So I see Amy Fawcett from the San Diego Working Waterfront. Amber, let's see, Amber Gunser. If you could let us know your affiliation.
Yeah, hi, I'm Amber Gunser. I am a senior associate at GNA.
Great, thank you. I see Gloria, our interpreter, Angelica Carrazzo from CARB, Ariel Fiddledye from CARB, Devin Widrow from California DOJ, Jack Munger from IEA, Michelle Guyron from Port of San Diego, the APCD staff we've already heard from. Let's see, Jenny Quintana from SDSU, Rob Swanson from California DOJ, Sam Peterson from UC San Diego, Sophie Silvestri, I believe from PASHA, is that correct?
Yes, PASHA Automotive Services, thank you.
Great, thank you. Vicky, and then Sterling Ross from SDG&E, and Tim Garrett from Sandac. Is there anybody else that I missed? Okay. Well, for that, I think we'll go ahead and move along to on our agenda. So at this point, I will now turn it over to Randy, who will give us a brief overview, kind of to start us off on what's happened to date.
Thank you, Nick. Following is a recap of the orientation meeting held in September and the kickoff meeting in November. During the orientation meeting, we discussed direction from the governing board to consider an indirect source rule, ISR, for ports, warehouses, and distribution centers. Other meeting items included WWG expectations, stakeholder input, meeting topics, format, and scheduling. The kickoff meeting in November included a discussion on the warehouse inventory, the district's legal authority to adopt an ISR, and other possible non-regulatory strategies to reduce emissions. Some of the comments received at the kickoff meeting include: smaller warehouses should be included in the ISR. There's a concern about what is not known at this time, for example, relationship between warehouse activities and diesel particulate matter emissions. How do warehouse emissions compare with other diesel sources? And which are the highest emitters and by how much? What is the history of transportation control measures that have been adopted? The alternative strategies that were considered but ultimately rejected by South Coast AQMD during the development of their Warehouse Rule 2305 should also be considered for San Diego. What is the timeline for the ISR development? And has the district developed a definition for a warehouse in order to identify subject facilities? Next slide, please. The following are some upcoming milestones. January 2024, begin developing a possible non-regulatory strategy and continue with public stakeholder outreach. June, identify possible regulatory actions to be pursued. By December, the district will provide an update to the Planning and Policy Committee or Governing Board, begin work on the CEQA and SIA documents, and develop the non-regulatory strategy and start implementation. By May 2025, conduct public workshops to present the draft regulatory strategy and continue outreach. June 2025, complete the draft CEQA analysis. By September 2025, go before the Governing Board for their consideration of adopting a proposed ISR. Next slide, please. We'd like to now pause the presentation to take any questions or comments you may have at this time. Please use the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you have a question or comment, or dial *9 if participating via phone. You may also post your question or comment using the chat button. Please self-regulate your time and limit your question or comment to 3 minutes per speaker and 1 minute per participant. We have 2 questions for you to think about. How does the schedule look for regulatory and non-regulatory options? And is there anything else we should be considering moving forward? I'm sorry, next slide, please.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions or comments about the schedule? Okay. Well, this isn't going to be the last opportunity to comment and provide feedback. So I think with that, also feel free to, if you have thoughts, feel free to put it in the chat as well. That's also fine. We'll take it, whatever feedback we can get. So I think we'll go ahead and move on to the next section, Randy. I'd say let's go ahead and get that started on rule development general principles.
Well, thank you. The following is an overview of the rule development process. After the first few meetings, we realized we haven't really described what our rule development process looks like, where the opportunities for engagement are, as well as opportunities to include or exclude certain things from a rule. So we wanted to briefly take a step back and walk through that process to make sure everyone is familiar with it. First, the need for a new rule or for a revision of an existing rule is identified. This may come from federal, EPA, or state, CARB, mandates, state law, district requirements, or other sources. The process begins with the background phase, which includes conducting research, identifying affected sources, evaluating possible control options, and gathering input from various stakeholders. Based on the results of this research, the feasibility of moving forward with a rule proposal is determined based on technological feasibility, cost effectiveness, or emission reduction potential. If the proposal is deemed feasible, rulemaking staff will develop and finalize the draft rule language and solicit additional input from stakeholders by conducting 1 or more public workshops. A workshop report is then prepared, addressing all comments and questions raised at the workshop, and the report is distributed. The draft rule is also revised as needed, depending on the comments received. Rulemaking staff will also finalize a socioeconomic impact assessment, SIA, as well as perform a California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA review. SIAs are required by state law and evaluate possible impacts on employment, regional economy, costs, and industries affected. A board letter package is then prepared and submitted to the governing board for consideration of adoption of the proposal. Once adopted by the governing board, the rule is submitted to CARB and EPA. The length of time the rule development process takes will vary depending on the complexity of the rule proposal. For example, a straightforward amendment of an existing rule may take up to 1 year to complete. Additionally, the district is in the early stages of incorporating an environmental justice analysis into the overall rule development process. Next slide, please. Here's a list of the various sections in typical prohibitory district rules. Applicability describes the source category that is subject to the rule. Exemptions. The rule still applies, but specified categories are either exempt from the entire rule or only certain sections of the rule. Definitions lists definitions of certain terms used in the rule for clarification purposes. Standards. This section usually lists an emissions or material content limit or other requirements. Monitoring or maintenance includes the monitoring of certain parameters or maintenance of equipment. Record keeping maintains certain records to verify compliance with the rule. And compliance schedules, a schedule of when certain rule requirements shall be met. Next slide, please. Following slides show examples of the different sections in a couple of district rules. This slide shows the applicability, exemptions, and definition sections of Rule 69.7, landfill gas flares. Rule 69.7 applies to landfill gas flares at a municipal solid waste landfill with emissions at or above the NOx major source threshold. The rule provides a limited exemption from certain sections of the rule for existing open landfill gas flares. Exemptions clearly define specific industries, products, or categories in which the rule altogether or certain sections of the rule may not apply. A few terms are also defined as shown. Very often, the definition section of any rulemaking can be very long, with the intent to clarify what is part of a rule and what is not. Next slide, please. This slide shows the standards and monitoring requirements sections in Rule 69.2.2, medium boilers. The standards sections of a rule, also sometimes referred to as the requirements, is really the section that sets forth what a facility must do to comply with the emission reduction aspect of any rule. This is where you will typically see the new or current emission standard expressed that facilities must comply with. For example, the standard for new units subject to Rule 69.2.2 is an emissions limit of 30 parts per million NOx for gaseous fueled units. Similarly, the monitoring requirements of a rule will lay out any emission monitoring requirements that might be in place for an emission unit to ensure the device or process is functioning properly. For example, this rule requires that a fuel meter be installed for a new boiler capable of burning both gaseous and liquid fuel. Next slide, please. Finally, this slide shows the record-keeping requirements and compliance schedule sections in 2 district rules. Under record-keeping, also in Rule 69.2.2, medium boilers, documentation of annual tune-ups and fuel usage shall be maintained. The record-keeping section is typically included to ensure facilities maintain adequate records of any device, product, or process that is used. Such information is typically needed as part of annual inspections by APCD's Compliance Division for enforcement purposes, or to submit reports to APCD's Engineering Division to develop facility emission inventories. The compliance schedule section, if applicable, will typically lay out deadlines by which information must be submitted to APCD or when emission standards are in effect. In many cases, a rule may be adopted by the governing board, but may not fully take effect until sometime later, or perhaps is phased in over time. For example, the compliance schedule in Rule 69.7, landfill gas flares, which is adopted in March 2023, states that new landfill gas flares shall comply with the rule upon initial startup. The deadline for existing enclosed flares was September 2023, about 6 months later, allowing time for the facility to comply with the new requirements. Next slide, please. We'd like to now pause the presentation to take any questions or comments you may have at this time. We have a few questions for you to consider. Are there questions about how exemptions could work as part of a rule development process? Are there other important definitions other than a warehouse that would be important to define? And what may still be confusing about the rule development process?
Great, thank you, Randy. Jack Munger, I see your hand up.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Randy. Could you go back, Randy, to your very first slide? Exactly. Excuse me. I guess I just want to understand where staff feels we are in this process, because when on that second box there where I see established need for new revised rule, I believe the direction was to consider an ISR, correct? And that would mean that really maybe this, instead of established, because this established means you've made some determination that an ISR is the best path to take, as opposed to determine the need for a new revised rule. To me, the word determine suggests that the district is going to weigh the latest emissions data. It's going to consider other CARB actions such as advanced clean fleets and other things that have taken place that would have an overall impact on potential benefits from an ISR. And then at that point, if it is determined that there is a reasonable return on an ISR, potential return, it would seem that's when you would go about the process of establishing the need for a revised rule. So I guess I just would recommend that. I think that's just a clarification in the process, and maybe I'm interpreting it differently than you are, but that would be my comment.
Yeah, Jack. I would agree that we're probably somewhere in that first gray box, the established need for new revised rules, and some of the language in this particular slide is kind of more general in nature and may not be directly applicable to the ISR conversation, but we are somewhere in the neighborhood of that first box. But I think we are still trying to look at all the different angles for a warehouse rule, be them regulatory and non-regulatory. So we are, looking at it from a lot of different perspectives there. We haven't gotten to that next step of APCD developing a new revised rule. We're still kind of in I would consider that first box more of a fact-finding phase. Background research phase is another way to phrase it.
Wouldn't it be more appropriate to refer to that as determine the need for a new revised rule, which I think is what we're talking about embarking on here, and to really not only just determine the need, but determine the need and the benefits from a new revised rule? Because I mean, isn't that part of what you're going to be doing before you would make a recommendation to proceed?
Yes and no. I think, you know, part of what we're hoping to get out of this group is to learn that, I think. So I would say partly yes. Part of the establishment of this group is to get more feedback and to get more information about what if we were going to proceed with a rule, what would that look like? And you know, while we haven't completely gotten that feedback to say yes, we are doing a rule or not, we're hoping to learn that over this process, I think. So it may be maybe just a slight difference in terminology there, but you know, I do think that we're still roughly along the same lines, I think, in what we're trying to convey there.
Well, I think though to devote time and energy into determining what the rule would look like before it's clearly determined or established that the rule is going to provide benefit or is needed, is not a good use of time and resources for anybody. You all or this committee. It seems that first we ought to be really clear that there is going to be a return, a measurable return, and what that return would be, so that as the governing board is making up their mind on whether or not a rule should be developed, they make up that determination, knowing full well what the benefits and costs would be. So it just seems, isn't it a little early in the process to be trying to discuss what the rule could look like?
Well, I don't think we've gotten there, Jack. I do think that we certainly haven't gotten to that extent. I mean, right now we're just kind of taking a step back and looking at, you know, if we have to do a rule, or if that's the direction we ultimately take, this is what it would look like. But, you know, we're talking about, you know, further on today about defining what a warehouse is. And so we're going to be having those conversations about what kind of benefits we might see in either in a regulatory approach or a non-regulatory approach in terms of emission reductions. We're going to be getting there. We just haven't gotten there yet. And so we just need to kind of set this foundation about, you know, as part of a regulatory process, this is what a regulatory process entails, because I'm not sure everybody understands, you know, how that works. So I understand the feedback that you're providing. And I don't think any decisions have been made at that point, certainly not at this point, but I just wanted to kind of clarify that a little bit.
And Jack, if I may add too, I think, you know, part of what we're trying to accomplish is doing as much of this work in parallel as we can, so that if we do get to a point where, you know, we get direction to move forward, we've at least had some discussions about, okay, what sorts of things might be feasible in a rule if we feel like that's going to get us some reductions. And I think, you know, as we'll talk about a little bit later today, you know, part of the reason for talking about warehouse definitions this afternoon or later today is because that could apply both in a regulatory and non-regulatory sense, right? Let's try to get a handle on, you know, what we sort of mean when we talk about the term warehouse or distribution center, and, you know, how that might, you know, identify potential regulatory approaches, or who might be eligible to participate in a non-regulatory approach based on those things. So I think, yeah, I completely agree with Nick. I understand, you know, the concept and the feedback that you're providing, but I think part of what we're trying to do is walk that line of, yes, continuing to do fact finding and data gathering so that we can identify what the benefits of any approach might be, while also in parallel, you know, trying to iron out some of those specifics so that we can proceed quickly once we've, you know, kind of gotten the information that we'll need to make that decision. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
Yeah, and I know you're under direction from the governing board to move as quickly as possible on this, and so I guess it's just I raised the issue, and you know where I'm coming from on that. I do think that looking at things such as the definition of a warehouse is productive, particularly to the extent it may lead us to determine that we ought to be surveying warehouses, or we ought to be doing some in-depth research to understand exactly what sort of warehouses we do have in San Diego County, beyond just an initial count of them. But what's the relationship in terms of their the truck traffic generated, the emissions they generate, and so forth. So I hear where you're coming from, and I understand the challenges you all have to live with. I guess I hope we can maintain some focus on really understanding what the overall need for an ISR would be, and what benefits could come out of it. And at some point, I guess somebody will have to be it's possible that somebody would have to be the bearer of a tough message back for the governing board, or at least some of the governing board members, that there is very little, if any, value to be enjoyed by creating an ISR, given the current state of information we have. I mean, just looking when the AB 423 was drafted, we were living off data from 2011 and 2014. That has now gotten quite old, and we still ought to have a good picture of where we really stand in terms of emissions. So anyway, I'll shut up and let some other people talk and ask their questions.
Great. Thanks, Jack, for the feedback. It looks like Jenny had her hand up.
Hi, this is Jenny Quintana from San Diego State University's School of Public Health. And I'm kind of embarrassed to ask a question because I had to miss the first two meetings because I had conflicting pre-existing meetings. So I apologize if this is already covered in previous meetings, but I certainly know that the communities near the warehouses are very concerned about making sure that their health won't be affected. And as we're getting more studies about health effects of goods movement on vulnerable communities, I can certainly understand that the science is supporting that concern. So my naive question is, in terms of documenting a need to get to what Jack Munger was saying, I'm just curious, is this mostly done through measurement of, say, toxic air contaminants near the warehouses? Is it done through modeling emissions based on the type of vehicles? And if so, are you collaborating with Caltrans on that kind of data? And I'm just curious what new data might be being collected, or if any is really being contemplated at this point.
Yeah, Jenny, that we haven't really so you haven't really missed much in regards to that kind of conversation. We didn't really get into that too much of that in our previous calls, but that's a great point. I think every rulemaking is different, and this certainly is one that's going to be unique, to where whatever direction we go, the data, we're going to be using the best available data that we have. We have somewhat of a model that has been done at the South Coast AQMD. If a rulemaking were to proceed, there is a model out there that looked at, basically looked at truck trip generation studies for large warehouses, and then, had emission reductions associated with the types of measures that would go into that rule ultimately. So it was kind of done that way, as opposed to looking at specific air quality in the specific regions. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that right, but that's usually how rulemaking is typically done. Is we'll have a kind of a baseline amount of emissions from a particular industry, and then we look at the control measure that we would be requiring in a rule, and then seeing what the reductions would be on kind of a region-wide basis. This particular effort, that could be could be more granular in nature potentially, if we can get a hold of kind of more granular data where we could look at specific regions to see, you know, what is the inventory in the border area, or what is the inventory in the portside area, and then look at the reductions more granular like that, to see what kind of a control effort would look like. So that's kind of along the lines that I think we're thinking right now of how this might go if a rulemaking were to proceed.
And Nick, if I might, I'll just add to that. You know, we did, as part of one of our updates to the board earlier this year, provide some information on kind of that South Coast model that Nick described. You know, looking at, I think it was larger warehouses and using that same methodology to sort of estimate what that baseline emission profile might look like in San Diego, and if we took similar actions, what sorts of reductions we might achieve. And the sort of feedback and direction we got from our board was, hey, you know, we'd like you to take a look at, you know, what additional benefits might be achieved if we were to potentially incorporate smaller warehouses, smaller than the 100,000 square foot threshold that they set. And also, to your point about, you know, proximity to warehouses, looking specifically at, you know, under-resourced communities. And so that, as Nick alluded to, that data is a little harder to come by, right? And so that's part of what we're hoping to get in discussions with this group is, you know, what opportunities might we have to try to wrap our arms around, you know, what that data might look like. As you heard from Jack earlier, part of that could be, you know, surveys or trying to identify, the estimated number of truck trips that visit warehouses of a certain size or warehouses within a certain region of the county. So that's really the sort of next step that we're trying to take is, okay, if we looked at something that was a little different than what they did up in South Coast, what would that look like in this region? Hopefully that helps.
Thank you very much.
And I would also add to that too, that we are through these efforts through this working group, we've already started to kind of get some leads and some information that we think could bear some fruit at some point. You know, we were on a call just earlier this morning with Sandag looking at some data that has come across our way in terms of truck volume data throughout the region. That's a pretty substantive data set that we think might be able to get some information that could potentially help in this effort. We're not sure how, we're not sure, you know, what that would look like, but, you know, through these conversations that we've been having, you know, we're starting to get some information that we think can help into ultimately where we're going, which is still to be decided, frankly, but we need to see the data first before we can, you know, see where we're going. We're also having some conversations with, you know, CARB and looking at what potential resources they might have. So, and as well as the city of San Diego as well, who had some interesting comments about some of the efforts they're doing on non-conforming land uses as well, which is certainly something we're going to be looking at as well, to see how that might fit into all of this. So if anybody is aware of certain data sets that could be of use, we're certainly all ears, and we can certainly discuss those either today or if you're more comfortable offline, we'd be more than welcome to have those conversations.
No, I think it's a challenging problem to get more granular with the data, since it doesn't seem fair for San Diego County to have to come up with methodologies that aren't really standard even at the state level developed by CARB yet. But I think that is the direction CARB has been going. I was on the expanded health advisory or some kind of group of scientists that was helping to advise about how to change our pollution regulation for the state of California. And that was certainly a big part of it in our discussions.
Well, we certainly look forward to hearing if you're able to join future calls. We certainly look forward to hearing more about that effort as well through these conversations. So yeah, and you're correct. This is a difficult thing. It's somewhat treading new ground in some ways, and to be able to put a South Coast approach and be able to model it down here in relation to some of our direction from our board members. That's why we're having these additional conversations, because it's somewhat difficult at this moment. Any other questions or comments at the moment, at least on the rule development process and how we go about that?
Nick, if I just might add on that rule development process, just wanted to kind of re-highlight for folks who may not be as involved with, you know, the district rule development process. The reason why we thought this was important to sort of explain, you know, the different components of a rule, from applicability to exemptions to definitions, was because oftentimes that's how, as you're getting through a rulemaking process or even considering those processes up front, you know, you're able to, you know, carve out certain situations that may not be appropriate to be applicable to the broader sense of whatever it is you're regulating. And so that's where things like exemptions come into play, or the way you define a certain term or a certain activity can be important, because, you know, it determines what sorts of standards those whatever it is you're trying to regulate, either the facility or an operation or whatever it is, what they may be subject to, and where they may, you know, have some breathing room based on whatever justifiable information you have to either include or exclude certain components of a facility or an operation. So we just wanted to kind of give that high level overview of the different components of a rule and how they interact with one another, as we get into this next discussion about the definition of warehouses and you know, why that's important, and how you can include certain things in a definition, but if you feel like, you know, certain components of a particular audience that you're trying to regulate may not need that regulation, that's where you can draw up exemptions and things like that to sort of carve out these additional you know, requirements, or, you know, things that don't apply to folks. So just wanted to tee that up for folks on the call that may not normally participate in district rulemaking activities.
I see 2 hands popped up. Let's see. I'm not sure who was first, Michelle or Sterling.
Sterling was first.
Oh, Sterling. Okay, go for it, Sterling.
Yeah, thanks. As always, good to see you guys. It's like a reunion. My question on this is, if your purpose is to limit truck trips, you're kind of dabbling into limiting commerce at the same time. So are you proposing some sort of volume tracking as far as truck trips go, or will there be some sort of pooling? It just kind of, to me, I'm not really sure how this works, even by defining what a warehouse is, unless you're just regulating what's happening in a warehouse. Now, I do need to say that as an SDG&E representative, we are 100% supportive of the electrification and how that moves forward. I'm just concerned about how this applies to the commerce side of it.
Yeah, that's a good question, Sterling. So I don't think that is our intent here, with any kind of regulatory or non-regulatory approach. Again, we haven't really gotten that far to say, you know, which or both would apply here. I think the intent of what we're trying to do here is to reduce emissions. And if that means less truck trips, or if it means truck trips that would be replaced from combustion vehicles with electric vehicles, or perhaps there's other avenues, other options that could be available to comply, similar to what the South Coast rule does, where they provide a menu of options to comply with the rule, one of which is to provide electric truck trips if you have that capability. On the flip side, there could be other options that could be on the table to also comply, that might not involve truck trips at all. So that's all going to be part of the thinking here, is what works best here in San Diego County, while also staying in line with some of the commerce and preemption laws that I think you're starting to bring up here, which is something that we're definitely thinking about, and was a major part of the South Coast regulation, was staying in tune and staying on the side of the law that says, yes, we aren't impeding with any kind of commerce or preemption issues at the federal level.
Thanks, Nick.
And just to add one more thing, thanks, Sterling. Nick touched on it. The Health and Safety Code clearly does give air districts the authority to regulate indirect sources, but there is a space with which we can work there, right? And so that's the other challenge that we're trying to navigate with this effort is, hey, how if that's the direction we choose to go or we're directed to go, how do we, navigate that in a way that, fits within the discretion that we're given, but also doesn't get into any of these preemption things, whether it's related to commerce or emission standards or things of that nature. So that's the sandbox that we have to play in that we're trying to kind of balance as part of this effort.
Michelle.
Hi, sorry, this is in response to the question, are there other important definitions other than warehouse? I also think you should define what square footage means or the area of the warehouse, building size versus the leased property, because if the warehouse is broken up into separate leases, are you looking at just certain leases where warehousing is happening, or are you looking at the whole building? And of course, warehouse operator and building owner. And then another thing to think about is, in addition to CARB regulations that target trucks, there's also building codes that reach beyond state codes. So these are called REACH codes, and City of San Diego, for instance, is proposing REACH codes that require new buildings to be all electric and non-residential, and I think also residential too, but I don't know, to include electric vehicle charging. I don't know all the details, but these are things to look at because a proposed rule may overlap with existing rules or proposed rules.
Yeah, that's great feedback, Michelle. That would certainly, all of those that you list would certainly need to be included for the benefit of a regulatory or non-regulatory approach. So that is definitely something we'll continue to look at. There are some examples of that in South Coast rule, I think, but at least on some of those first ones that you mentioned, we'd have to look into some of these REACH codes that you're mentioning to see what may be appropriate down here. Clearly, that might be a little different with certain cities doing different things. So we'll certainly take a look at that and hopefully have some more conversations with the City of San Diego and other cities that would have those in place.
Thanks.
That's great feedback, though. Thank you. Okay, I think we're at time here for this section, but I did want to quickly do a quick check on attendance too. I saw a couple other folks join in to the meeting. I see Madison Swain. If you could just mention your affiliation real quick, that would be great, just so we know who's on the line.
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is Madison Swain. I'm an assistant professor of city planning at San Diego State University.
Great, thank you. And then I think I saw Caitlin Arduino. If you could just briefly state your affiliation, if you could, that would be great. Okay, if not, we can go back to Caitlin in a second. So, okay, I think we'll go ahead and move on to our next section, and I will be taking that section on, which is to define a warehouse. And it could include other terms in various sources here. But defining what the universe of facilities we're looking at from a regulatory and non-regulatory scope for a warehouse or distribution center emission reductions, as we said, was really important. And this has been expressed to us at various working group meetings and governing board meetings as well. So today we did want to just dive deeper into that and to look at some definitions that have been used in various areas and perhaps see which one might be a good fit for San Diego, or maybe there's some kind of combination of certain ones that could be developed. We wanted to kind of dive deeper into that today. So we're going to devote quite a bit of time to it. As we previously mentioned at past meetings, APCD is initially considering the warehouse definition as a starting point with the AQMD Rule 2305 definition, which is noted on the slide. However, we do want to caveat that APCD is not necessarily committed to using that definition, especially if it needs more clarity or is vague in some way. For example, a quote-unquote warehouse may not be entirely dependent on even having a quote-unquote building in some contexts to be included in a rule. So some of the definitions you'll see here today probably have more of a focus on quote-unquote facilities or having a physical footprint, but we could also look beyond that in terms of that distinction. And so those are some of the things we'd probably like to get your feedback on today as well. So to start off, as I said, there's some definitions included on the slide from AQMD Rule, Warehouse Rule 2305. AQMD defines a warehouse as a building that stores cargo, goods, or products on a short or long-term basis for later distribution to businesses and/or retail customers. There's a couple other definitions we wanted to note on here too, and this kind of goes to Michelle's point a little bit about, and this is just a couple that we pulled out. There's a lot more in the rule. But a warehouse size, AQMD defines warehouse size as the indoor floor space measured in square feet of an individual warehouse building that may be used for warehousing activities. They go further to define warehousing activities as operations at a warehouse related to the storage of distribution of goods, including but not limited to the storage, labeling, sorting, consolidation, and deconsolidation of products into different size packages, supporting office administration, maintenance, manufacturing areas, or retail sales areas open to the general public within the same warehouse building that are physically separate from the warehouse area are not considered warehousing activities for the purpose of this rule. And just trying to stress that those points. That again, that's in the current AQMD Rule 2305 definitions. Next slide, please. So other definitions of warehouses we found in use by various agencies or publications are on the following slides here. The first is a definition employed by the California Department of Justice, which defined a warehouse or other quote-unquote logistics facility as a facility consisting of one or more buildings that stores cargo, goods, or products on a short or long-term basis for later distribution to businesses and/or retail customers. So you can start to see that definition is somewhat fairly similar to the Rule 2305 definition to some extent, just as an observation. Further, the city of Fontana actually had a truck trip generation study that defined warehouses as being primarily devoted to the storage of materials. They may also include office and maintenance areas. And that, again, that differs a little bit with what we were seeing in the South Coast definition. They're similar, but they're also different in small ways. Both definitions are somewhat broad and could be interpreted to cover a lot and a large number of facilities. And that could have been done unintentionally, or it could have been also been done by design. Whether or not we want to take a similar approach with any kind of rulemaking or non-rulemaking strategy here in San Diego is an open question. Next slide, please. So another definition we found was in an Institute of Traffic Engineers truck trip study, or ITE is the acronym. which was prepared for the development of AQMD's Warehouse Rule 2305. Their definition of a warehouse for the purposes of their study, which was commissioned by AQMD, they started to get much more specific than the definitions that were presented so far. So ITE's definition of a warehouse was clarified as a high cube warehouse, something called a high cube warehouse, or HCW. And that is what they considered as a building that typically has at least 200,000 square feet of floor area, has a ceiling height of 24 feet or more, and is used primarily for the storage and or consolidation of manufactured goods, and to a lesser extent, raw materials, prior to their distribution to retail locations or other warehouses. They go further on to clarify 5 specific types of high cube warehouses in particular, which included the following. The first was transload, which were considered usually pallet loads or larger handling products of manufacturers, wholesalers, distributors, or retailers with little or no storage durations. The second one was a short-term storage high cube warehouse, which was comprised of products held on site for a short time. The third one was cold storage, which was a high cube warehouse with permanent cold storage in at least part of the building. The fourth was a fulfillment center, which was storage and direct distribution of e-commerce product to end users. And then finally, a parcel hub, which was a transload function for a parcel delivery company. So think of it as a UPS kind of distribution type of facility. Next slide, please. So now we're moving kind of outside the state of California. Those definitions were somewhat in the state of California, but other states have also started to define warehouses in more specific ways. So the following example we found was located in a proposed assembly bill, A9799, that was in the New York State. The bill wasn't passed, but it was proposed a few years ago. And it had the intention of setting forth a similar kind of ISR type of program to reduce emissions from truck traffic from warehouses. And the proposed bill defined warehouses as specifically, quote unquote, heavy distribution warehouse, and which included facilities that fell under one of the following categories. And these may sound a little more similar to the last definition. The first was a fulfillment center, which they considered a facility whose primary purpose is storage and distribution of e-commerce goods to consumers or end users, either directly or through a parcel hub. The second one was a parcel hub, which they consider as a last mile facility or similar facility whose primary purpose is processing or redistribution of goods for delivery directly to consumers or end users. By moving a shipment from one mode of transport to a vehicle with a rated capacity of less than 10,000 pounds. So it's a very specific definition of a parcel hub. And then finally, a parcel sorting facility, which they consider a facility whose primary purpose is sorting or redistribution of goods from a fulfillment center to a parcel hub. So clearly, this particular definition was much more targeted in scope for the purposes of this particular proposed bill. But at the same time, it was very simplistic in what it was covering and what it was not covering. That's the sort of thing that we can look at as part of our potential strategy. Next slide, please. And then finally, this final definition we found in this bill was actually passed in California. This was AB 701, adopted in 2021, which included a definition of a warehouse distribution center for consideration. The bill defined a warehouse distribution center specifically as an establishment defined by any of the following North American industry classification codes. So NAICS, I think, is the acronym that most are familiar with. And however, I think there's further denominations of how those codes are used, but as long as you had these certain codes in your NAICS code, definition, then you would be considered a warehouse distribution center for the purposes of this assembly bill. So the first one was 493110 for general warehouse and storage, 423 for merchant wholesalers and durable goods, 424, which was for merchants, wholesalers, and non-durable goods, and 454110, which was for electronic shopping and mail order houses. And in particular, the bill made mention that a warehouse distribution center definition per the bill did not include a specific NAICS code, which dealt with farm product warehouse and storage. So it effectively acted as an exemption in the bill to agricultural farm product type of operations, so that they would not be covered by this particular bill. As we understand, NAICS codes are typically self-assigned by companies or the federal government. Most companies will have a NAICS code. They either do it themselves if they want to qualify for incentives or government contracts or that sort of thing, or loans, or the government will assign that code for you, as we understand the process. So most industries have that, as we understand, but we'd be interested to get any feedback about that. So next slide, please. So again, we wanted to pause here. We know that was kind of a lot of definitions and information kind of thrown at you, but we did want to have two questions that we'd like for you to think about. The first was, are there any warehouse definitions that really resonated with you for potential use in San Diego? And two, are there any missing components to any of these definitions that we presented today that you think we should consider for use in San Diego? So with that, I will pause for a second, and I do thank you, Caitlin, from Murphy Development Company. Thank you for joining us. No worries on how to unmute, but we do appreciate you joining. So we'd be interested in any feedback or discussion on the warehouse definition side of things, to see if there was any that really resonated with you, if there's any that are clearly off base. We're interested in hearing more from you today about those. Another way to perhaps describe this is this group more in favor of a more general definition that perhaps that we're seeing in some respects with the AQMD rule, which is pretty broad and could be interpreted in a lot of different ways? Is that the approach that would seem to make sense to cover a lot of our bases here in San Diego? Or do we want to be more targeted in our approach and to really define the specific entities that we think need to be either included or excluded from any kind of rulemaking or incentive program? Keep in mind, we're probably going to be using whichever definition interchangeably between regulatory and non-regulatory approaches. And when it comes to incentive programs, that, depending on who's in and who's out of a particular regulation, could really impact as well who could apply and be able to get incentive monies in a non-regulatory approach. So it's kind of an important distinction that needs to be made, as others have highlighted in the past, that this is kind of a critical one that is important for us to see.
Looks like Jack has his hand up.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. Sorry. Go ahead, Jack.
That's okay. No problem.
Got confused.
On that previous, no sweat. On that previous slide, Nick, electronic shopping. Do you know what that is? Is that a Fry's warehouse, or any idea what that is? The D?
I don't specifically know. I would imagine it would be something similar to a I would not hazard to guess right now. I think we'd have to dig into it a little further to figure out if that's like a retail type of setting, or if that's more of like a distribution type of facility that would feed into like a Best Buy or a Fry's or something like that. Is that kind of where you're asking on that?
Yeah, it was a little confusing because it says electronic shopping, which leads you to believe it's probably retail. And if it is, why was that one particular component selected as opposed to all the other things that you can shop for? And you know, I mean, is that a Fry's? Is that a any place that sells all the electronic, just computers and electronics, or is that a store that has refrigerators, freezers, and all that stuff? So I just was wondering what that meant in their case. And I understand if you don't have an answer, but that would be interesting to know because it looks like it's focused on retail.
Given that it's lumped in with mail order houses, Jack, I'm thinking that it's probably the method of shopping, not the thing that you're shopping for. So I'm thinking they're talking about an online shopping distribution center.
Okay.
But
Okay.
but we haven't researched it and we can get back to you.
Gotcha, sure. And then in terms of a general comment on, to answer your questions with regard to preference on the definition, I believe that South Coast's definition for the most part is along the lines of what seems to be applicable to San Diego, with some exceptions, of course. A lot of the others are, well, to me, they're kind of excessive. But I guess the point I would want to make about that is that South Coast in particular, and when you talk about warehouse size, unless we specifically omit office and administration, then really we would be targeting warehouses and office buildings all over San Diego County. So I guess my suggestion would be that office use or administrative use of a warehouse facility would not be considered in terms of determining the square footage of that building. Otherwise, I think we're in, you know, if you're a warehouse owner, because there are warehouses that the vast majority of their space has been turned into office or administration or other uses, gym, workout facilities, all that type of stuff. There's been quite a variety of those. So just to be focused on the overall square footage is not enough. I think it needs to look at the use that's actually going on there. And then I think it would secondly be important to establish if there is a link relationship between truck traffic, excuse me, let me put it this way, link between square footage of a warehouse and the truck traffic associated with that size of a warehouse, and also the DPM that's generated as a result of the truck traffic that might be associated with that warehouse. I think it would be a mistake just to make the assumption, as we've heard actually in some of our other meetings, not by you all, of course, but by others, that well, a big warehouse must generate a lot of truck traffic. Well, I think there's evidence to the contrary of that, and that would be something we would need to look into. But so just to summarize, I think square footage is key, use is key, and square footage is key. The square footage for actual warehousing facility, kind of more along the lines of what South Coast uses in terms of their wholesale distribution definition.
Great, thank you for the feedback, Jack.
Sure.
I did see Randy chimed in with in the chat. I'll just kind of read it. So if folks can't see the chat for some reason, but it looks like he found a little bit more specificity in the makes code for that particular electronic shopping one. And I'll go ahead and read it for the benefit of the group. It says, this industry comprises establishments primarily engaged in retailing all types of merchandise using non-store means, such as catalogs, toll-free telephone numbers, or electronic media such as interactive television or the internet. Included in this industry are establishments primarily engaged in retailing from catalog showrooms of mail order houses.
Okay. Got it. Just like Kathy thought.
I think so, yeah. I'm still digesting it a little bit myself, but I think that's correct.
Every once in a while I get one.
And we don't want to overlook it when that happens.
Oh, and Randy put in a couple other examples too. It looks like in the chat as well. So I won't read these verbatim, but it looks like there's plenty of material where we can also look into a little bit about what exactly that particular code is. And like I said at the beginning, that's one particular example that was in a bill that we found that seemed to kind of hone in and on trying to be specific about the scope of what we're looking at. Whatever the bill is, I can't even recall what that bill was for, but that was it was just another way to kind of differentiate what's subject to this and what isn't. And whether or not that's kind of the full story about what we want to include as part of our effort, that's still the open question. But it provides some tea leaves, at least, for us to think about, things that could be in or out.
And Nick, just to sort of speak to what Jack was saying regarding the activities component, like thinking of that South Coast warehouse, right? There's the definition of whatever the physical space looks like on the ground, whether that's a building or an area. Kind of Michelle sort of referenced, it could be multiple buildings, whatever the physical footprint is of a particular facility or location, I think is one aspect, but possibly more importantly might be that activities component and what is actually occurring at that space that's resulting in indirect source emissions, i.e., truck traffic coming in and out. And if I recall correctly, and you may have some insights on this or it's something we can look into, as part of South Coast regulation, when they did develop it and roll it out, I think I recall hearing that, hey, there were a few things that came up, post rule implementation, which always happens, right? That illuminated a few things from the activities perspective that they may not have thought of. And so certainly that's the other part of this effort, right? Is learning from other folks who have done this before, and if there are opportunities to factor in or factor out certain activities, that's something that we want to pick up on. So I tend to agree that maybe the definition of the physical space or footprint of whatever the facility might look like, while certainly important, the actual activity associated with what's going on there might be the more important component of this effort.
Yeah, that's all correct, Mike, and I would agree. We've had some conversation with South Coast staff, and a great majority of their time spent after the rule was developed and even up to this day is simply fielding questions from facilities that think they might apply to the rule or may not apply. So the better that we can define either the activities, the physical space, everything, if we can, try to get a handle on that as part of the initial rulemaking. And that's, I think, where you were saying, Mike, where they've had some I don't want to say second thoughts, but they probably, they could have saved some time, I think, on the back end if they had been a little bit more descriptive, perhaps, about, what's included in their rule and where are they trying to go. So we'd be hoping to do something like that here, both for the benefit, again, for a regulatory perspective or a non-regulatory perspective, because it will matter either way.
Looks like we have a couple of hands.
Sure.
Michelle, I think, was next.
Yes. I have a question about, I think reading all these definitions, some of them are more explicit than others. I used to work at a manufacturing facility. They made specialty products. The warehouse only had 2 truck bays. I think the warehouse space probably had a lot of unfinished pieces that went into the finished product. And I think resolving how manufacturing facilities would be in a rule like this would be important, because the place I worked at, I can't imagine that would be one place you target, because there wasn't that much truck activity, but I think there was, places for the where they stored the unfinished products. So I think it's important to talk about finished products versus unfinished, because those take up space, and what sizes of the warehousing space is above the threshold for this rule, or non-regulatory option.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. That's a great point. That is something that I I know personally I would want to get a better handle on, I think, as part of any effort we do here. Even reading ourselves kind of how South Coast treats their manufacturing space versus non-manufacturing space in relation to their rule isn't as clear cut as I would have preferred, I guess, if we were writing the rule. There's definitely some space to be a little bit more direct in how that's approached. So especially with the manufacturing side of things. Yeah, point well taken on that. I see Tim Garrett's hand.
Thanks. So my questions, I'm noticing in all of these definitions, there's no reference to like the number of truck trips, which is ultimately the thing that you're trying to regulate with a potential rule or non-rule strategy. I'm wondering if it makes sense to kind of have like a two-part definition. Like one could be focused on the physical building, and the rule potentially, or whatever, it would apply unless the facility can demonstrate that they don't receive a certain number of trucks. I don't know, that maybe that's not really a good burden to put on a business because they might not keep track of like all their FedEx deliveries and things like that. But in terms of like the normal course of business, if they can demonstrate that they're not a facility that's receiving lots of trucks, then that could be like a way out of having a rule potentially apply to them. But in the absence of that information, you would assume that the building footprint determines that that is a warehouse. But yeah, otherwise, I like the South Coast definition the best. I think it's like the most the broadest, and I think it kind of like gets to the fact that all of those types of activities probably would target businesses that are, you know, attracting lots of trucks. And I would probably shy away from the definitions that are reliant on NAICS codes or anything that could be potentially manipulated in order to avoid compliance with a rule. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, great feedback, Tim. That's really good. And we'll definitely think about a two-parter definition. If we can get to that point, that would be great. I think what South Coast did is they kind of incorporated that truck trip data into a level kind of underneath that, if that makes sense, where they, you know, the truck trip data was kind of incorporated into this WIPCO factor, which is, I'm not going to get into it here. It's really difficult to understand, but it's basically kind of a factor that says if you have a WIPCO score of under 10 or something, then you're only applicable to just reporting in the rule, or you don't have to do the actual compliance part of the rule that the larger facilities that have WIPCO scores above that might have to do. So I think that's somewhat built into the AQMD regulation, but we'll certainly do a little bit more digging on that. But I think that kind of gets to where you're going on that. I think if that definition were kind of utilized here, that probably would be a factor that would be included either directly or indirectly, kind of like how they did it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea too, Tim. One of the things that I would want to hear some feedback about is that it would probably then add some, for those warehouse operators or warehouse owners that were wanting to, let's say we did write an exemption in that, if there was a regulation and we put an exemption in that said under a certain threshold of truck trips per week, month, year, whatever it is, you would be exempt. But it would be incumbent on whoever's subject to that potential regulation to then have to track that information. And so now you have another potential place where a business could be subject to a compliance action that say that they're not tracking those trips, and we have a compliance inspector come out and take a look at that warehouse operation, and they say, well, where are your records about your truck trips? And they say, well, we don't keep records, but we know we're under a certain level. Then there's the possibility of a compliance action to say, well, yeah, you probably are under that, but you haven't been keeping track. So now we have to write a compliance action for that. So just something to keep in mind. I do like the idea of it, we do that for several rules at the district for our low use requirements. For example, if you're subject to a rule, but you're a small operator, you may be exempt if you use less than a certain threshold. So it's something to think about, certainly, but it does add an additional regulatory burden on those exempt facilities to keep track of that.
Great point, Kathy.
Yeah, just to add on, I agree with Kathy. I think that is something to be mindful of. But I also think that, given the data, some of the data gaps in this type of industry, there may not be a better way to try to approach that, at least initially, right? Because if we're looking at the data that South Coast used, and let's just to say that we all agree that, for facilities of that size, over 100,000 square feet, that, hey, we think that that's a reasonable estimate for those facilities. Given that our board has asked us to look at smaller facilities as well, certainly not anywhere near that level of data associated with that. And so, we could try to come up with the best data we have available, but we're certainly not going to be able to cover everything out there, right? And so building in some sort of methodology, hopefully in a way that is less burdensome, to be able to allow people to say, yeah, I may operate in a space that's X square feet, but it's clear that I'm not a significant source, and here's the data to demonstrate that. I think that's a interesting component to look at, like we said, both from the regulatory perspective and even a potential non-regulatory option. Like if we're talking about incentive funding, right? Theoretically, you could draft something up that whatever incentive amount you're eligible for is based on the number of truck trips that you receive, right? And so it comes into play in both capacities there. And so we would almost want to do the inverse if you were looking at an incentive component, right? Hey, just because you're a warehouse of this size, prove to us that you actually get this much truck traffic, so that we can help you mitigate it. So that really good things to think about. And thanks for bringing up that point, Tim. I think that's something that we'll want to think about in either direction.
And I think that's a good segue to maybe perhaps going into our next topic, where we are going to be talking about some potential non-regulatory incentive strategies that, again, these are ideas. Nothing's set here. These are really just trying to get the juices flowing. So we'll just caveat it with all that. But again, I'll kind of touch base on the timeline aspect again that we laid out at the front of the meeting. We're really going to be trying to push non-regulatory strategies and develop that first. That's what we had taken to our board to kind of say, hey, we're going to really push forward, some non-regulatory strategies that we think could potentially help in the interim while we're looking at any potential regulatory approaches. And so that's why we continue to kind of focus on what we might want to do here and get the feedback from the group. So in particular, we've started to look at some ideas, again, kind of as food for thought, to see if these might be some concepts worth exploring or modifying in some way. In past meetings, we had mentioned the idea about the possibility of doing what's called a community identified project, and through the AB 617 CAP program. This is a project that requires approvals by CARB and the AB 617 steering committees, like the ones in Portside and the border areas. But it allows the Air District to utilize our community air protection incentive money in a broader and more flexible way than the regular guidelines that CARB has attached to some of these funding processes. It's more flexible to do, provided the projects are supported by the steering committee members. So there is some caveat to that. But one example where the district has already done a community identified project is in our zero emission truck pilot program, which we're doing with the Port of San Diego right now. It's actually a current project that we're actively soliciting applications for. So if anybody's interested in that, please let us know. But kind of using that particular program that was vetted through the steering committee and CARB that got approval, we kind of were thinking, okay, what's a good springboard for something like that to potentially encourage more zero emission truck trips at warehouses? And so we brainstormed kind of a possible approach that might mirror that program's requirements, since the ports program seeks to accomplish the same goal of encouraging more zero emission truck use at their site. So it's very complementary. So one possible incentive model approach, or similar one that we could potentially look at maybe, is to provide grant funding to affected warehouse entities prior to their compliance deadlines if there's a rule in place. That's kind of a key aspect that we have with all of our grant programs. We can't pay for compliance. But that program would provide some grant funding to the warehouse entities to purchase either zero emission trucks or infrastructure at their facility. And as mentioned, this would have to be in line with what our board has directed us to do, which is to look at smaller warehouses, including those in disadvantaged communities, and possibly have a program that could be tiered to target those kinds of facilities, either on the smaller warehouses or larger warehouses in certain ways. So for example, such a program, we might have a small or a medium warehouse that might be located in an under-resourced community, perhaps with warehousing, perhaps a warehouse size less than 100,000 square feet. So that just kind of artificially kind of put that number there. Perhaps those facilities might get a larger grant amount in this kind of a program to cover any heavy duty vehicle costs that would be associated with zero emission. It could also cover the cost of a 3-year lease payment for a ZEV truck. That's something that our zero emission truck pilot project does today. So that's something that where we could prioritize the facilities and the operators that really do need the help and want to make this switch. For larger warehouses above that 100,000 square foot threshold, or maybe there's warehouses outside of disadvantaged communities, that grant amount could be lowered, to purchase the same equipment, but it might still be, that opportunity may still be there. Just in making sure that the money is going to where it's needed most, into the facilities that might require that or want to make that switch. So that's one possible example that we're floating out there for feedback. Another possible model that we could look at, and it's based on another really popular and successful incentive program done by Santa Barbara Air Quality Management District that was set up a few years ago. In that case, that program was for ocean-going vessels, but if you look at the approach, is where we were thinking there could be some possibilities with how they used and got emission reductions from that kind of approach, but apply it to warehouses. And so that program, which was a vessel speed reduction program, it works pretty differently than we have a vessel speed reduction here at the Port of San Diego. However, it's voluntary. There's no real incentive-based component of it, at least a financial incentive component to it, where this program and the Santa Barbara program actually would provide grant funding to affected warehouse entities, as we see it, where we could target those incentives to warehouse entities in particular, if they could sufficiently demonstrate that, yes, they did receive zero emission truck visits to each of their facilities. So you're kind of looking at it on a per truck basis, where you're still reporting and you can actually demonstrate, hey, I did have a zero emission truck operator that visited me however many times last month. I'm going to get an X amount of dollars for that trip. Like I said, the vessel speed reduction program in Santa Barbara operates somewhat similarly to that, where they encourage vessels to move slower through the channel. In our method for warehouses, we might just be encouraging trips to occur in zero emission format. The warehouse entities could be of any size potentially to be part of this program. We could also encourage trucking companies potentially to be a part of this program. We think that would probably require them to pre-register in some way to be a part of the program. That's how Santa Barbara does it, at least. And then after you're approved in the program, then participating ZEV trucks could install a satellite monitor or some kind of other tracking device that would be able to, show these staff further on down the road when you're looking to get reimbursed that, yes, I did have those zero emission truck trips from this particular truck and it went to my facility at X time. So we need a way to verify that trip and location data. And for vessels, that's kind of a no-brainer. For those large vessels, they have that kind of technology there. We know there's satellite technology trackers out there for trucks. To what extent we could use it for this is kind of uncertain right now, but that kind of technology seems to exist. And then, after we would verify the trip data and location data, then we would issue a payment per zero emission truck visit that you would receive, and a to be determined amount. We'd have to look at kind of the market structure and see what would make sense to make that work. But again, it would probably have to be in line with some of our board's direction, which was to, encourage or prioritize zero emission visits at smaller warehouses and those in disadvantaged communities. So maybe a smaller facility might get a greater per truck visit amount, as opposed to a larger facility who might get a smaller amount per trip, or however we want to do it, but also just be in line with our board's direction. Next slide, please. And then the final one we kind of just wanted to walk through, and this is something we heard at previous meetings, was we could potentially target our incentive opportunities for projects in conforming land use areas, or potentially partner with someone like the city of San Diego or other cities where these non-conforming warehouse facilities may be encouraged or incentivized to relocate. So this is something that was briefly discussed, I think, at our previous meeting. But we'd encourage everyone to go back to the recording just to take a look through that, just to listen in if you're not familiar with the concept. But for background, a non-conforming use in the planning sense is a facility that is technically no longer allowed because land use regulations have changed. However, that facility can still operate since permits were already issued and remain in effect. Kind of the result is a non-conforming facility that's been designated that title. It can't grow and it can't expand their footprint. However, they can still continue to operate up until a certain point. And so what the city of San Diego mentioned at their last meeting was that they're looking at updating some of their non-conforming facilities in the city of San Diego specifically as part of their environmental justice element in their general plan update. And it's something that they're looking to do probably early next year. And the city may investigate, potentially retiring non-conforming uses. So if there's warehouses in particular that could, that if the city desires, they have maybe perhaps put a timeline or time limit on those non-conforming uses to say those facilities need to be out of that area by a certain timeline. That's something that they might be considering as part of their separate effort, or they potentially could be including incentives to help, move those facilities to relocate into a conforming use area. So that's all work that's being done that's kind of complementary and kind of separate to what we're talking about here, but there's certainly a connection in kind of the work that we're doing as part of this working group. And so, that information that could be coming out as part of the city of San Diego's environmental justice element is something we're going to be looking at pretty intently here at APCD, and seeing how that might help us identify facilities or potential incentive pathways, both on the regulatory and non-regulatory side, to seeing, especially in incentives when it comes to, which facilities we should be helping, and not helping when it comes to a non-conforming use. And it also could present an opportunity for us to collaborate with not only the city of San Diego, but perhaps the county at the regional level or other local cities that would potentially expand that approach to a broader network, so that we're not just looking at non-conforming uses in the city of San Diego, but perhaps we're also looking at it on a countywide basis, so that one city's problem isn't creating another problem elsewhere by moving a facility outside a non-conforming space and then putting it into a different city where that effort really hasn't started yet, if that makes sense. So just wanted to highlight that as a potential pathway that we could further explore down the road too. So next slide, please. So again, we're going to pause here and get some feedback on some of those ideas that we wanted to float out there in the non-regulatory space. 2 questions to pose to the group for you to think about. We'd like to get do you have any thoughts about the potential non-regulatory options presented today? Are we off base? Are we crazy in what we're thinking about? Is there something better? We'd love to hear that. And then do you have any other suggested non-regulatory options that we might want to explore? We're open to any kind of feedback we can get in terms of things that might be able to work, and that could potentially result in emission reductions in this sector. So I'm going to shut up because I've been talking for a while, but I'd be open to any kind of feedback from anybody here in the group.
Nick, I think Tim had an interesting concept in the chat that I just wanted to highlight regarding the Santa Barbara sort of VSR model of maybe looking at that as an opportunity to both incentivize the indirect source itself, i.e., the warehouse or distribution center, as well as a sort of, co-benefit or co-incentive to the fleet or the truck owner or operator that is coming to that warehouse. Because again, I think that's another kind of universe that exists, is there may be some of these facilities and operations that own and operate and maintain their own fleet, right, that are coming and going to and from the distribution center. But in many cases, there are other entities that are, coming into those facilities. And so that sort of 2-pronged idea, I think, is something interesting that Tim pointed out that might be worth thinking about.
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely going to be something that we're going to need to think about if that's kind of an approach we end up taking. We ultimately want to get the goal here is to reduce emissions and to get those reductions one way or the other. And it's going to require relationships with both of those entities potentially to do that, especially through an incentive model. So that's a great point, Tim. I agree. I think that's a good aspect that we would probably want to look into.
And I think just kind of thinking out loud, in theory, that vessel speed reduction or ZEV trip, increase incentive model, in my mind, if folks are looking forward, folks that operate that own and operate these trucks are looking forward and seeing that, hey, there's these ACF regulations coming down the pike. If there's an opportunity for them to make a decision on the space they might use to store their goods, and that can be influenced by, hey, if I, rent or lease space from this particular warehouse that's participating in this program, I can receive some additional funding to offset the costs associated with the investment I'm making in this new zero emission truck. If I do it in advance of, some of these regulatory timelines that are coming down the pike. So that's the way that I think about it in my mind. And like you said, I think we would have to set that incentive amount at something that makes sense and, moves the needle and becomes a real draw or enticement for folks to enter into a program like that. But I like the idea.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear from the group if that if something like that would work in practice. I mean, it seems to work with larger. That's the vessel speed reduction in Santa Barbara has been very well received by those companies out there, those big shipping fleets. Granted that they're kind of in control of their operation, you know, from kind of step one to the end. Granted, we have kind of two different aspects that Tim has highlighted here, that where you have a warehouse entity and then you have an owner operator truck, or sometimes they have their own trucks. It's kind of a mishmash. You know, for the folks that have more experience in the room with operating warehouses or with trucking fleets, I mean, is that kind of a model doable where you have kind of a, you know, two-pronged kind of incentive? And do we think it would work? I mean, it certainly depends on the amount, I'm sure, at the end of the day, of how much people are getting. But if that amount could potentially offset the additional costs of a zero emission truck visit in some way, shape, or form, and it's meaningful, we'd be interested to hear if that might potentially have some benefit. I see Jack's hand.
I think, Nick, that would be an approach far superior to what we saw in South Coast, which really lays all of the burden on the warehouse owners, operators, to report, and then to, you know, with the hope of increasing the or lowering the amount of emissions that comes from the vehicles attending their facility. It puts all the burden on the warehouse owner. I've heard time and time again, and this would, I'm sure, be the case for a smaller warehouse operator, that they don't have control over the truckers that are bringing products to their facility. Maybe the big ones do, but I would suspect that the smaller ones don't. And I would certainly suggest that we would really want to talk to some people more involved with the trucking industry than I am. But that's what I've heard time and time again. So if you had a program that incentivized both parties, the people who are in the best position to reduce the amount of diesel emissions and enhance electric trucking vehicles and increase those numbers, that would be, in my opinion, an incentive program that would have a much higher chance of success and having some impact than just lowering the boom on warehouse owners.
Great, thank you for that feedback, Jack.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'd definitely be exploring that and learning from those entities about what could and what couldn't work as part of that approach if we were to proceed that. But yeah, that's encouraging to hear that could be an interesting option to consider. I'd also ask if, I mean, I'm fairly confident that the technology exists to capture satellite data of where these truck operators might be going, so that we could verify that data. But is anybody more familiar with kind of trucking operations that would be able to confirm that on this call? I mean, we were talking about tracking satellite stuff in incentive programs probably a decade ago. So, you know, I feel like that technology is probably out there, but I would love to hear it from folks who are more in it than I am to see if that is true. And if we don't have those people on the line today, we can certainly try and look for information that might be able to confirm our suspicions on that.
Can you hear me at all? This is Caitlin.
Yes,
you can. I, as an owner of these industrial buildings, do not get into the operations of what the users do, but I believe Alejandra Miraturan is part of this group. She's not here today, but she runs Otay Mesa Chamber of Commerce, and I know that she probably can speak to this. I just sent her an email, but I know that they represent a lot of trucking companies and businesses down in Otay that would certainly be concerned about this sort of regulation. So with the electrifying trucks, I know that's already a huge burden of cost. So I think you're going down the right path with the incentives and trying to get them help to operate this way.
Great, thank you for that feedback, Caitlin. And we definitely have conversations with Alejandra, and she's been a part of these conversations, I think, previously. So we'll certainly be in touch with her and then her members as well. We have a lot of relationships with trucking companies in the border region just through our own existing incentive programs. So we could certainly gauge their feedback on this as well as part of those conversations.
Great.
Any other feedback on non-regulatory approaches? And I would encourage people to really think about that. Like we said, we're hoping to really kind of hit the ground running on a couple of ideas here, moving into the new year about where we want to go for non-regulatory stuff. So, you know, if you do have additional thoughts after this meeting, or if there's some concept or idea you wanted to discuss with us offline to see if that might work in the context of kind of our programs that we have now, we're certainly willing to hear more about it. And we'd love to hear more about other ideas that we could explore. So,
Nick, sorry if I may, your comment just reminded me of something, and maybe Kathy can help us with this too. Like you talked about at the beginning, likely if we were to think about a creative incentive program, right, we would need to run it through those community steering committees and then through CARB for approval. And so there's timing aspects associated with that, right? And so sort of coming up with a concept to at least float by those groups, sometime in the not too distant future, I think would be where we want to get, so that we have then time to go through that, kind of vetting and approval process that's required in order to use those funds in a more flexible manner. Is that fair to say, Kathy? And do you have any sense for kind of what that timeline might look like? And I know that's kind of a open-ended question, because it would probably depend on what sort of idea we're proposing, right?
It does. Yeah, I would say a simple, if we were proposing something along the lines of something that's already an existing incentive program that was just maybe expanding the amount of money available, or the, kind of pushing the edges of existing programs, that's a quicker process. I would say that would, we still have to vet it through the steering committee and get CARB's approval on those. So it takes, a good 6 months to go through that process. If it's a more extensive, like if we were talking about paying truck drivers per trip to an affected facility and setting up a structure like that, that would, I think, be a longer, like a year or more kind of process to figure out how to put the appropriate controls in place. And to, figure out a structure for being able to do that, and vetting that through the steering committees and CARB. That's a bigger lift, but there's certainly very interesting ideas. And I think we'd want to hear more from this group and other stakeholders about if that's something that we want to pursue.
Great. Any other feedback? Oh, I see Jack.
Thanks. Kathy, I guess maybe that's why it hasn't been done anywhere that I've heard, is because of the time and effort it would take to look at both those. But we do have Trucking Association representatives as close as Los Angeles and others in Sacramento who I think could provide that feedback. And the thing I like about it is it recognizes the market. It says that the district understands that there are two distinct parties necessary, whose cooperation and involvement is necessary, not just the warehouse owners, but the truck drivers themselves. And if in fact it turns out that there's a huge percentage of individual truck owners, which is something I hear a lot about from San Diego, you're talking about guys who own their rig and that's it. And it's maybe that's again why it hasn't been done, because you've got a huge universe of people to reach out to. But at the same time, it recognizes the market, it recognizes who the parties are that we need to have participate in this if it's going to be successful. Just to focus on warehouse owners doesn't is only half the issue.
Yeah, good feedback, Jack. Okay, I think we're creeping up on time here, so I do want to probably move on to our last slide or two here. But thank you again for all that great feedback. That was really good. I was taking out a lot of notes here, and we'll probably go back and watch the recording to make sure we got everything. At this point, if anybody does have any kind of comments or suggestions that are unrelated to our discussion topics today, but still kind of in the warehouse space, indirect source space, we can certainly open up to one or two comments about that if anybody has any.
Nick, I just put, excuse me, into the chat. I didn't catch this earlier. I apologize, but there's a comment from Amy Fawcett with the San Diego Working Waterfront beginning of our presentation. She had a question about where in the flow chart the MOU discussions with the Port of San Diego is. Do we want to talk briefly on that?
Sure. I would say the MOU is probably getting looked at a little differently than the flowchart. If you're referring to the flowchart that was kind of the rule development principle slide, that's kind of being treated a little differently. But I think you'll hear more about the MOU discussions with the port both tomorrow and next week about where things stand on that effort. The Port of San Diego has an item on their board meeting tomorrow afternoon where they're going to be briefing their board about the conversations that APCD and other between our conversations between APCD and the port. And then APCD's board will also hear an update from us next week at our respective board meeting on the 14th, which I believe it starts at 2 o'clock for us. Where they'll hear a very similar kind of update. And then we're going to be getting feedback from both of our respective boards to see where things stand on that. But through that effort, you'll be able to hear some of the ideas that are being looked at right now, possible timelines of what we're thinking. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in that kind of port-specific MOU effort to tune into those board meetings tomorrow and next Thursday. Okay, I think we're up on time, but I did want to go to the next slide real quick and just note that our next.
I think Tim Garrett had a
sorry.
quick comment.
Go ahead, Tim. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Sorry, no, just a quick one. I was in a different webinar before this meeting, and it was a presentation from the staff at the Wilmington Area Planning Council in Wilmington, Delaware. And they have a framework for how they consider equity and goods movement planning. And they have a framework that divides things into 3 areas. So there's protect, manage, and accommodate. So protecting is about protecting jobs and industry in like certain areas of their jurisdiction. Managing, which is kind of like balancing when there's like a mixed uses, like kind of more industrial area along with more sensitive uses. And then the third one is accommodate, which is like the most sensitive area that maybe still has a little bit of industrial activity. And I think that that's the thing that we're trying to focus on the most with this potential rule. That's like the direction you got from your board, is making sure that the most affected areas are the ones that are seeing the most pollution reduction. So just wanted to bring that up as like a way to think about also that there could be different rules in place potentially, or different incentive structures for different parts of the county depending on existing land uses and existing socioeconomic status and pollution levels, for example. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Sure, great, thank you, Tim. Yeah, if you have any information about that session that you were part of, feel free to pass it along to us. That would be interesting to read about. So we're at time here, but I did want to note, so our next meeting is going to be held on Tuesday, January 2nd. We would normally meet on the first Monday, but that happens to be January 1st, so nobody's going to be working, hopefully. So Tuesday, January 2nd is our next meeting. The next meeting might, we're looking at potentially a later time frame for that meeting to happen, potentially in the 3 to 5 p.m. time frame, just due to some scheduling difficulties. So just be aware that that is likely going to be the time moving forward for these future respective warehouse working group meetings to accommodate staff schedules. And as a reminder, we're going to be sending notifications by email. So make sure you're subscribed to that WWG email service if you're not already. And if you're not, we can certainly get you signed up. Also, I do want to note that if you are going to require live translation services, if you can, at this upcoming meeting, to please let us know as soon as possible before December 29th. So we have time to inform our translator in advance if they have a need to attend or not. So we just want to make sure that we're being respectful of their time as well. So if you do have a need for translation, please let us know. We'll try to do our best to remind people in the email that gets sent out as well about that. So our contact information is here. And if there's any last comments or feedback, otherwise I want to thank you everyone for your time and dialogue today. I think it was a good meeting. So appreciate everyone's time. All right. We'll see you on the 2nd.
Thank you.
Thank you.